The day was perfect, almost aggressively so. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of the manor house, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fairies. I stood in my wedding dress, a cloud of ivory lace and silk, and looked out at the manicured lawns where 300 guests were mingling. Everything was exactly as I had dreamed it would be since I was a little girl. The scent of roses and lilies hung in the air, and the gentle hum of happy conversation was the perfect soundtrack. My soon-to-be husband, James, was down there looking impossibly handsome in his tailored suit, the very picture of a perfect groom. From the outside, we were the perfect couple. He was charming, successful, and adored by everyone he met. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of grand gestures and public declarations of love that made my friends swoon with envy. He had swept me off my feet, and I had fallen hard and fast. I truly believed I was the luckiest woman alive, about to marry the man of my dreams. Yet even in this moment of supposed bliss, a tiny, cold knot of unease was coiled in the pit of my stomach. I dismissed it as wedding day jitters, a normal bout of nerves before making the biggest commitment of my life. But if I was honest with myself, the feeling had been there for a while. It was a fleeting shadow that would appear in the moments just after his most charming displays, a quiet whisper that asked if this perfect man was, perhaps, too good to be true. Walking down the aisle on my father's arm, all my anxieties seemed to melt away. The moment I saw James standing at the altar, a brilliant, reassuring smile on his face, the world narrowed to just him. The ceremony was beautiful, a blur of heartfelt words and shared glances. When it came time for the vows, James's voice was steady and clear, his words a poetic masterpiece that brought tears to the eyes of half the guests. He spoke of destiny, of soulmates, of a love that would conquer all. My own vows felt simple and plain in comparison. I spoke from the heart, talking about his kindness, the way he made me laugh, and my promise to stand by him through everything. As I slid the gold band onto his finger, his hand felt warm and steady. He looked deep into my eyes, and for that moment I was completely certain. The cold knot in my stomach was gone, replaced by a soaring, unshakable joy. This was real. This was forever. We were pronounced husband and wife, and as James leaned in to kiss me, the crowd erupted into cheers. The kiss was passionate, almost possessive, and for a second it felt less like a celebration and more like a branding. But the feeling was gone as quickly as it came, lost in the whirlwind of applause and congratulations as we walked back down the aisle, officially starting our new life together. The reception was a lavish affair. The champagne flowed freely, and the grand hall buzzed with energy and laughter. The speeches were heartfelt and funny. My father spoke with quiet emotion about his little girl, and my maid of honor shared embarrassing but sweet stories from our childhood. Then, James's best man, Tom, took the microphone. He was a charismatic guy, but his speech started on a slightly strange note. "To James," he began, raising his glass, "a man who always gets what he wants. And believe me, when he wants something, you don't want to be the one standing in his way." A few people laughed, assuming it was a joke about James's ambition and drive. Tom continued with a story about a university rugby match where James had lost his temper spectacularly over a bad call from the referee. He framed it as a funny anecdote about James's passion, but the story landed awkwardly. I forced a smile, but my hands felt cold. I had seen flashes of that temper before. The time he'd slammed his fist on the table because a restaurant lost our reservation. The way he'd gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with rage, when another driver cut him off. He always apologized profusely afterwards, blaming his passion and his protective instincts. Hearing Tom joke about it in front of everyone made it feel less like a quirk and more like a well-known and perhaps tolerated character flaw. Our first dance was to a song that James had chosen, a beautiful, sweeping ballad. He pulled me close, his hand firm on the small of my back, and for a few minutes The world outside of our embrace disappeared. The guests watched, many with tears in their eyes, as we swayed to the music. It was the picture-perfect moment, the romantic climax to a fairy tale day. Then, halfway through the song, he leaned in, his lips close to my ear. I expected a whisper of love, a sweet nothing to mark the moment. Instead, his voice was a low, sharp hiss. "Why did you let your father hug you for so long? You almost wrinkled the side of the dress. You need to be more careful. Everything has to be perfect tonight." His words were a splash of ice water. I pulled back slightly, my smile faltering. Wrinkled the dress? He was worried about a wrinkle? His grip on my back tightened, forcing me back against him as if nothing had happened. He smiled for the crowd, but the eyes looking down at me were cold and hard. The song ended, and the guests applauded, oblivious. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, of being utterly trapped in a beautiful moment that had suddenly turned ugly. Later, it was time for the cake cutting. The magnificent five-tiered creation stood as the centerpiece of the hall. The photographer and videographer gathered around, and our guests formed a semicircle, their phones held aloft to capture the traditional moment. James and I stood together, holding the silver knife, his hand placed firmly over mine. We smiled for the cameras, the perfect couple once more. We made the first cut together and the crowd cheered. As we served the first slice, a wave of playful energy came over me, a desperate attempt to recapture the joy of the day. After he took his bite, I took the tiniest, most delicate dab of white icing on my fingertip and gently touched it to the end of his nose. It was an innocent, classic wedding gesture, something you see in movies and at countless other weddings. A wave of warm, gentle laughter rippled through our guests. It was a sweet, light-hearted moment. But as I looked at James, his smile was gone. It didn't just fade, it vanished, as if a switch had been flipped. His eyes, which had been warm and laughing just a second before, turned to chips of ice. A terrifying dark rage contorted his handsome features into something I had never seen before. The air crackled with a sudden, terrifying tension. The laughter from the guests died in their throats as they saw the look on James A.'s face. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The violence in his eyes was enough. I took a half step back, my playful smile frozen on my face, a knot of pure fear tightening in my chest. "James?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then it happened. It was so fast, so shocking, that my brain couldn't process it at first. In one swift, brutal motion, his leg snapped out. He didn't kick me in the stomach or the chest. He kicked my feet, hooking his expensive, polished shoe behind my ankles and yanking forward. It was a deliberate, calculated trip, designed to humiliate. My heels, my heavy dress, and the element of surprise gave me no chance. I fell. I crashed to the polished dance floor in a heap of ivory lace and shattered dignity. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air out of the room. The DJ, seeing the commotion, abruptly cut the music. In the cavernous hall, filled with 300 people, there was a sudden, absolute, and deafening silence. My first sensation was the hard, cold floor against my cheek. The second was a searing, white-hot wave of humiliation that washed over me, so intense it felt like a physical burn. For a long moment, I just lay there, tangled in my ridiculously expensive dress, the symbol of a dream that had just turned into a public nightmare. The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Slowly, I pushed myself up onto my elbows. My head swam. I looked up at the man I had married just hours before. James was standing over me, his chest heaving. His face was a battleground of emotions. The tail end of his blinding rage was being replaced by a flicker of wild panic as the reality of what he had just done in front of 300 witnesses began to sink in. He looked down at me on the floor, not with concern, but with the terrified gaze of a man who had just been caught. I scanned the crowd. Every single guest was frozen, their faces a gallery of shock, disbelief, and horror. They stared, not knowing what to do or say. In their eyes, I saw my own humiliation reflected back at me 100 times over. This wasn't a private argument. This was a public execution of my dignity, and everyone I knew and loved had a front-row seat. Before anyone else could move or speak, a figure detached itself from the frozen crowd. It was my father. He was a quiet, gentle man, not prone to drama or confrontation. His face was completely unreadable, a calm mask that betrayed none of the emotion that must have been raging inside him. He didn't shout at James. He didn't cause a scene. His movements were slow and deliberate. He walked directly to where I was, his eyes never leaving mine. He ignored James completely, as if he wasn't even there. He knelt down beside me on the floor, his old knees cracking softly in the silent room. "Are you all right, my love?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a lifeline in a sea of chaos. I could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He gently helped me to my feet, carefully brushing the dust from my dress and straightening my veil with hands that were surprisingly steady. He stood with me, his arm a solid protective presence around my shoulders. He didn't need to say anything else. His quiet, powerful action spoke volumes. He was with me. He was my shield. The spell of silence was finally broken by a frantic, bustling sound. It was James's mother, her face a mask of forced composure. She scurried to her son's side, completely ignoring me on the floor. She grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent and fierce into his ear. James, who was still pale with shock, just nodded numbly. Then she turned to the stunned guests, clapping her hands together with a brittle, jarring cheerfulness. "Oh, dear," she exclaimed, her voice painfully loud in the quiet hall. "Just a bit of wedding day excitement. James has always been so clumsy, hasn't he? A silly trip. It's what happens when you have two left feet." She let out a high-pitched, unnatural laugh that fooled no one. Her words were more chilling than the kick itself. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't ashamed of her son. She was in damage control. Her immediate, instinctive reaction was not to help me or admonish him, but to lie, to cover it up, to create a palatable excuse for an act of public violence. In that moment, I understood that this was a pattern. This was normal for them. Standing there, held up by my father's steadying arm, I listened to my new mother-in-law's pathetic, desperate lie. I looked at my new husband, who was now nodding along, a flicker of relief on his face as he grasped the excuse she was handing him. He wouldn't have to take responsibility. It was just a silly trip. My humiliation, my shock, my pain. It was all just a clumsy accident. The fog of shock that had enveloped me began to recede, replaced by a wave of absolute icy clarity. I saw my future with this man stretching out before me in a horrifying panorama. I saw a lifetime of these accidents, a lifetime of his rage and his mother's excuses, a lifetime of being told I was overreacting, that it was my fault for being in the way, for provoking him, for not being perfect. In that silent, crowded room, a decision formed in my mind, as hard and clear as a diamond. This was not the beginning of my marriage. This was the end. He had given me a gift, in a strange, twisted way. He had shown me exactly who he was, and he had done it in a way that could not be denied, explained away, or hidden behind closed doors. He had done it in front of 300 witnesses. With a resolve I didn't know I possessed, I gently detached myself from my father's arm. I walked the few steps to the DJ's booth, my head held high. The DJ, a young man who looked like he'd seen a ghost, stared at me with wide eyes. I calmly took the microphone from his trembling hand. I turned to face the crowd, my family, my friends, and the man I had married. My voice, when I spoke, did not shake. It was clear, calm, and amplified by the speakers, ringing through the silent hall. "I'd like to thank you all for coming here today to celebrate with us," I began, my tone even. "You have all been witnesses to a very memorable day." I paused, then turned my head to look directly at James, whose face was now a mask of dawning horror as he realized what I was about to do. "I have a final announcement to make," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The reception is over. The party is finished." I held his gaze. "And so is the marriage." For a second, there was stunned silence. Then, the hall erupted into chaos. James lunged forward, his face contorted with rage and panic. "Amelia, don't be ridiculous! You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice cracking. His mother shrieked and tried to grab the microphone from me, but my maid of honor and bridesmaids had already formed a protective wall around me. My father stepped in front of James, not touching him, but simply standing there, a silent, immovable object. The look on my father's face was enough to stop James in his tracks. Guests were shouting, some in support of me, others looking confused and horrified. It was a scene of utter pandemonium, the beautiful, elegant reception having descended into a verbal brawl. Through it all, I remained calm. I handed the microphone back to the shell-shocked DJ. The decision felt so right, so clean, that the chaos around me seemed distant, like watching a scene from a movie. I had taken back control. He had tried to humiliate me, to make me small. But in doing so, he had given me the strength to stand taller than I ever had before. "Let's go," my father said quietly, his hand on my arm. My bridesmaids clustered around me, and together, we began to walk towards the grand exit. We moved as a single unit, a phalanx of support cutting a path through the bewildered guests. I didn't look back at James, at his screaming mother, or at the 5-tiered cake that now seemed like a monument to a colossal mistake. Walking out of that hall was the hardest and easiest thing I have ever done. I was walking away from the life I had meticulously planned, from the future I had invested all my hopes in. I was walking away in my wedding dress, a symbol of a promise that had been broken before the ink was even dry on the marriage certificate. As the cool night air hit my face, I took a deep breath. It felt like the first real breath I had taken all day. The weight of the dress felt suffocating, but the weight that had been lifted from my soul was immeasurable. I had walked into that hall as a bride, ready to start my life with someone else. I walked out as just myself, alone, but, for the first time in a long time, completely and utterly free. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, tearful phone calls, and an overwhelming flood of messages. The story of the wedding kick had gone viral among our social circles. I was inundated with support from friends and even strangers who had heard the story. They called me brave, strong, and inspiration. But there was another side, too. James S. family and some of our mutual friends launched a campaign to paint me as a hysterical, overdramatic villain who had ruined a man's life over a silly mistake. James himself was relentless. His texts and voicemails were a terrifying roller coaster of emotions. One minute he was begging, sobbing, promising he would change and go to therapy. The next, he was furious, blaming me for embarrassing him, for provoking him with the icing, for being an unforgiving monster. The mask was not just off. It had been shattered. The charming, perfect man I thought I was marrying had been a carefully constructed character. The real James was the man in those voicemails, volatile, manipulative, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for his own actions. Every venomous text was another confirmation that I had made the only choice I could. The most validating call came about a week later. It was from a woman I didn't know, who introduced herself as James's ex-girlfriend from university. She had heard the story through a mutual friend and had felt compelled to reach out. "I just wanted to say I believe you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I'm so sorry." She told me her own stories. Stories of doors being punched, of arms being grabbed too tightly, of verbal tirades over the smallest perceived slight. She had lived in fear of his temper for 2 years, always making excuses for him, always believing his promises to change. She had left him after he threw a glass at the wall near her head, and his family had told everyone she was unstable. Hearing her story was a profound, heartbreaking relief. It wasn't me. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't overreacted. The kick was not an isolated incident born of wedding day stress. It was a glimpse of the man he had always been, a man who had been protected by a wall of enablers and excuses his entire life. He hadn't tripped me. He had saved me. Looking back, the most humiliating day of my life was also the day of my liberation. That single, brutal act of violence in front of everyone I knew was a strange and painful gift. If he had waited until we were behind closed doors, I might have made excuses. I might have believed his lies. I might have spent years trying to be perfect enough not to set him off. But he couldn't wait. His rage was so powerful that he couldn't even maintain the facade for our entire wedding day. The public nature of his abuse made it undeniable. It gave me the clarity and the courage to walk away and never look back. It's a harsh lesson to learn, but red flags are not invitations to try harder. They are warnings to get out. My fairy tale wedding ended in a nightmare, but it saved me from a lifetime of terror. I walked away from that reception not as a victim, but as a survivor. This story was difficult to share, but I hope it serves as a reminder to trust your instincts and to know your worth. If you believe in the power of truth and want to hear more stories about finding strength in the darkest of moments, please subscribe to our channel and join our community. You never know whose life you might change.